Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined again by Dr. Paul Bloom. He is professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and Brooks and Suzanne Ragen, professor emeritus of psychology at Yale University. And today we're going to talk about his latest book, Psych, the Story of the Human Mind. So, Dr. Bloom, welcome back to the show. It's always a big pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me back. I always enjoy talking with you.
So tell us first, in modern psychology, as you say in the book, and I think everyone within academic psychology would agree with this, in modern psychology, we have a mechanistic conception of mental life. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so the book is meant to be an accessible introduction to all of psychology, covering the whole field. And it's meant to be entertaining and interesting. It's not a textbook. But I do begin by talking about certain beliefs that all psychologists have. And one is that the mind isn't magic. It falls onto the same rules and principles as any other physical thing. So the mind is, in fact, a product of the physical brain. It's a physical thing. And it works in a sort of causal, determined way. If I ask you why you did something, and a psychologist can figure out, so why did you recognize that as a tree? Or why did you choose to eat this food and not that food? Why did you fall in love with this person, not others? The answers we give involve sort of, well, this caused you to do this, and that caused you to do that. And it's mechanistic and causal. It's not like we could give the complete answers for any of this, very far from it. But the answers we tend to give aren't any different in kind than a meteorologist would give, or a chemist, or a physicist. They involve sort of regular physical processes.
Mm-hmm. And how can we be sure, or how do we know that the brain really gives rise to the mind, and the mind is not really something that could be separate from the brain, from what operates in the brain, let's say?
Well, we can't be totally sure. I know some people who think we're a simulation, or our brains could be backed up on a computer and uploaded to the cloud and all that, and that makes it kind of complicated.
Yeah.
But the fact that right now it's these things between our ears that mediate thought has overwhelming evidence to support it. Nowadays, you can actually watch the brain at work. You could have somebody think about playing tennis or eating a sandwich or kissing the person they love, and you could kind of get some sense of what they're thinking by which parts of the brain are activated. What we knew long before that is damage to areas of the brain. If you, like, as in dementia or a stroke, or short-term damage, like if you get drunk, can affect the most intimate aspects of your behavior. Your judgments, your lusts, your anger seem to be very related to this physical thing. So that there's sort of empirical evidence that the brain plays a powerful role in thought is very strong. There were also long problems with alternative. So Rene Descartes, a brilliant philosopher, argued for that the mind is really separate from the brain. It's in another realm.
Right.
But how does this immaterial thing connect to this material thing? How is it that we can decide what to do and then move our physical bodies to do it? How is it that perception can get into the physical body and convey itself to the immaterial realm? It's much more parsimonious, much more elegant, I think much more true to think, for instance, that your memories are embedded in structures of your brain. And damage to those structures of your brain can make those memories go away.
So if dualism is incorrect, why do we need to study the mind and not just the brain?
It's a good question. I think there's a difference between the claim about dualism, a meta claim, this is how things really are, versus, and to say it's false, the mind and the brain are one. But then to say it's a different question, well, how do you study it? And for that, you can work on different levels. So when I study a computer, how a computer plays chess, or how ChatGPT uses language, we're going to talk about the programs it runs, the tricks it uses, the statistics it uses, and so on. We're not going to talk, for the most part, about the machinery it's made of. Now, that doesn't mean we're dualists. We don't think there's some magical level where this arises above the machinery. But what it does mean is that some things are best understood at a higher level. And for psychology, for the mind, the idea of the higher level is we shouldn't be so much looking at neurons or biochemical interactions. We should be thinking about beliefs and desires and thoughts and plans. So most of psychology works at the level of the brain, though of course we're works at the level of the mind, but of course we're very interested in how it connects to the brain.
Mm-hmm. So still talking about how modern scientific psychologists approach human psychology, there's also a question that seems to be contentious within the field, and it's not just in psychology, but also across cognitive science and neuroscience. Is the mind modular? I mean, what do you think of the idea of the modularity of the human mind or even other animal minds?
So people use the word modularity in very different ways, and there's very strong notions of modularity. Some identified with philosopher Jerry Fodor, and we could have a large, very technical discussion of whether or not that's true. But there's a sort of a softer notion, which I think is true, and I think isn't that controversial, which is, our brains aren't just one big piece of porridge. Our minds are not one big diffuse thing. I think it's uncontroversial that everybody agrees that to some substantial extent, our minds have different parts that work in different ways, that are connected to the brain in different ways. The way in which you recognize objects, you say, oh, that's a chair, and that's my girlfriend, and that's the moon, is different from the way in which you do mathematics, which is different from the way that a system within you gets angry if someone swears at you on the street, which is different from how you learned a long time ago how to walk, which is different from the systems that control your blood pressure and your heart rate, which are also in the brain, which is different from the mood regulation and damages that happen with schizophrenia or psychosis or mental illness. These are separate things with separate stories. So, in my book, I review theories of how we figure, how we navigate the world, how we say how far something is, how big something is. And these theories don't have much to do with our theories of when we fall in love. And the reason why is you don't tell the same story. Just like the body contains many different organs, so the story of the heart is not the same story as the story of the bladder. They work in different ways. They do different things, different functions, different purpose. The story of memory is not the same story as sexual desire. Mm-hmm. In that sense, I think the mind and the brain are modular.
So getting into some more specific questions about human psychology, what do we know about consciousness? Like, for example, how it has evolved, what functions it serves, what gives rise to it? I mean, at this point in time, what do we know about it?
So there's a lot we do and a lot we don't know about consciousness. Like we were saying, psychologists believe, and I think there's strong reason to believe that conscious experience is a product of the physical brain. Mm-hmm. How the brain gives rise to consciousness is a matter of tremendous debate. The philosopher David Chalmers calls it the hard problem. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard. Like, it's not even clear we have an inkling of how physical things can be sentient. We know, by the way, how physical things can be intelligent. You might have thought that'd be a mystery too, but computers solved it. We build machines that are as physical as anything you could imagine, that can play chess, that can do mathematics, that can navigate, that can do all sorts of smart things, that can communicate, as in modern AIs. And that's really interesting. But how they become sentient is a mystery. Having said that, there's a lot we know about consciousness. We know that people have different conscious experiences in very interesting ways. Some people have mental imagery that they could call to their head an image of a face right away. Other people can't. Some people have voices in their heads. We're not talking about mental illness, just they have a voice, and other people don't. Some people see colors in different ways than others. We know there's these differences, but we also know that there's similarities. So we know that our attention is naturally limited. Suppose you have a popular podcast. You have a podcast. Your podcast is playing in this ear, and another podcast, Sam Harris's podcast, is playing in this ear. So I'm listening to both the podcasts and that. Well, I could focus through my force of consciousness into one, listen to it, and ignore the other, or this one, ignore the other. I can't listen to them both. It'd be save so much time to listen to two podcasts, but you can't. You could flip back and forth. Our consciousness, our attention is limited. That's one discovery about consciousness. Another discovery about consciousness is how hard it is to turn off sometimes. I've been a long time insomniac. It's hard for me to get to sleep. And if I could have the gift of shutting down consciousness, I'd be very happy. Just an off switch I could throw on myself, maybe a timer so I wake up. But it's very difficult. So issues of consciousness, problems of consciousness often have a clinical, sort of very important value. So there's a lot we know about consciousness, and a lot we don't know.
But about consciousness still, and because this might tie into other things that we might talk about later on in the interview, do you think that there's good evidence that it has some sort of causal power over cognitive mechanisms or over our behavior? Because of course we know that many of the stuff that goes around in our minds occurs at a subconscious level, and there are people who argue that consciousness is mostly epiphenomenal. But what do you think about it?
So people often mean different things by consciousness when they have this debate, but there's one sense of consciousness which does seem to be really valuable and adaptive. And this is the idea of information that's accessible to all systems. So often what you say, what you mean, if I say something is unconscious. So I have an unconscious belief about something, or I have an unconscious prejudice, or I have an unconscious knowledge of some part of language that I use to understand sentences. To say it's unconscious means if you ask me, I can't tell you. I don't know. It's very useful, though, to have some parts of your knowledge accessible to you so that I can write it down, I can tell you about it, I can think about it. So suppose when I judged people, I had an instinctive judgment. Oh, I see. Oh, you're a nice guy. I like you. Boom, I got that. But it was unconscious. Then I'd never be able to tell you that you're somebody that you're a nice guy. I'd never be able to think back on all the nice people I know because I need a favor now and choose you. I wouldn't be available to me for thinking. And the idea of a pool of information that's available for me to think about, talk about, reminiscent about, do sort of reasoning about, so I have to, let me rank how kind people are in my life and put a ranking. That stuff, in that sense of consciousness, you want some things to be conscious. If it was in the system, but I couldn't get at it, none of that would be possible. And I wouldn't, for instance, be able to talk about what I know. To the extent we can talk about our experiences and our memories, they have to be conscious.
And of course, in presenting what we know about the several different subfields in psychology, you also get a little bit into the history of psychology and go through some of the main figures in, for example, the 19th and the 20th century, one of them being Freud. And I would like to ask you about Freud specifically, because now we know that many of his theories have been disproven scientifically or considered unfalsifiable. And I mean, that sort of criticism we even heard very early on from people like Karl Popper, for example. So is there anything about him, his theories, that you think might still hold some scientific value?
I think there is. I teach intro psych, and my book is based on my intro psych course. And some of my colleagues teach the course and don't mention Freud at all. And they say, why would I teach that quack? Everything he said is wrong. Why would I waste my students' time? There's so much to learn. But I think that although so many of Freud's ideas are wrong, maybe almost all the specific ideas, but the oral stage and the anal stage and the castration anxiety, penis envy, all that stuff, it's very little support for any of it. But I think his big idea is right. He wasn't the first to come up with the notion that we have a dynamic unconscious. Other people had it before. But he developed it. He extended it. He made a lot of it. And he said that this is one of the big shocks to the system. He said, one of them was the discovery that we're not the center of the universe. The second one was Darwin's discovery that there's no special creation for humans, that we've evolved through the same evolutionary process as every other creatures, rats and cockroaches and monkeys and everything. This is the third. The third is that we are not masters of our own house, at least to some extent, that we are driven by unconscious forces and desires. Now, maybe everything he said specifically about how that worked was wrong, but the insight was right. And a modern day psychologist agrees with Freud. A modern day psychologist has the question of, suppose I'm really interested in why did somebody vote for this character? Well, I'm not going to go ask people. It's interesting to ask people, but I have to accept the fact that even if they're honest, they may not know. If I want to know why you run this podcast, I can ask you. That's fair, and you'll tell me. But any good psychologist has to say, maybe it's for reasons you're not aware of. And that insight was something really pushed forth by Freud, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for it.
Mm-hmm. But apart from that insight, and particularly throughout the first half of the 20th century, don't you think that Freud and the psychoanalysts perhaps had too much influence on scientific psychology, or not? I mean, taking into account how little science or how unscientific it can get, let's say.
If you're asking me, could I, if I was in charge, could I have sort of shut down the Freudian program a bit earlier so we got more better stuff done? Maybe yes. Yeah. But I'll say something else in defense of Freud, which is there's other ways to get insight about the mind besides experimental research. I think we should have a certain sort of humility. You can learn a lot about, suppose you're interested in marriage and what it's like to be in a marriage. Well, there's a lot of books psychologists have written about experiments and studies, but I wouldn't go to Google Scholar if I really wanted to learn. I'd pick up a good novel. I'd talk to people who are married. I'd watch some really good TV shows about marriage. And I think Freud, though not scientific, though, as we're agreeing, really wrong in so many ways, had some great insights, great thoughts. You know, you read one of his books like Civilization and its Discontents, and so much of it's just wacky, but so much is deeply smart. So I think there's real value in the man.
So what about another major figure like Skinner and behaviorism in general? So what do you think are some of the most important insights that we got from the behaviorists?
So Skinner's more recent, of course. I'm old enough to have met Skinner. I went to a hockey game at Harvard once, and Skinner was the head of what I actually view, and maybe not a nice way of putting it, a fairly weird cult called behaviorism. And the idea of behaviorism is we're going to do a science without any mention of ideas and mental states, no memories, no perceptions, no dreams, no goals, no emotions, no motivations, just behavior. Just stimulus and behavior. The same principles that work for rats and pigeons work for people. And you ask what's good in it, and I think there's a lot good in it. I think that Skinner and his colleagues and his predecessors like John Watson and Ivan Pavlov really learned some interesting things about conditioning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, how to teach non-human animals to do things. Why is it that maybe certain phobias develop? Why is it that certain superstitious behaviors develop? There's real insights in there. And I think we should keep them. But the general research program of doing psychology without reference to the mind, I think was always a disaster. And I'm kind of relieved that my field has grown out of it.
But I mean, do you think that just the idea of studying just behavior and ignoring the mind that there might be some sort of scientific merit to it or not?
No, I mean, I know Skinner did. Skinner thought, I'm doing real science because I'm just doing studying just observable things. But the weird irony is that that's not what the real scientists do. Like, imagine you're an astronomer or a physicist, you're studying the sun. And then you say, I'm not going to talk about what we could see. I'm not going to make any speculation what's inside the sun because we can't see it. You say, why not? Imagine somebody who's a geneticist at the time of Mendel, who says, I'm not going to talk about parts of the cell I can't see under a microscope. Why not? Why do scientists posit things? They say there's invisible things and we try to understand them. We posit mechanisms. We make hypotheses about things, about inner things. And for some reason, Skinner thought being a scientist involves not talking about inner things, particularly given that in his case, the truth of the inner things is manifest to everybody. I don't know if Skinner deep down believed that people didn't have thoughts. But if you tell me I'm going to do a science and then my starting point is that people don't have thoughts, that there's no such thing as wanting anything, I say, well, you're starting off with a supposition which is as wrong as something could be. Why should you go that way?
Right. And of course, and now within mostly the field of developmental psychology, in last century, we had a major figure like Jean Piaget. So what do you think are some of the most relevant insights that we got about particularly child development from him?
So Jean Piaget was a brilliant scholar. You mentioned about Freud, that his work couldn't be falsified and had all these problems. And also for Skinner, the same accusation came through. But Piaget was doing serious business. He was really making a science of babies and science of children. And his work could be tested and explored. He himself was an adept and clever experimenter and a keen observer. One thing he did was simply brought to the attention of psychologists and scholars how amazing the minds of children were. Just got us to study them, got us energized the field to study them. And then he made a series of, I think, broad and very interesting claims of the limitations of babies and children. He claimed that babies, for instance, lack object permanence. They, if an object goes out of sight, they think it ceases to exist. He thought that much older children were egocentric in a sense that they couldn't take the world from someone else's perspective. He thought that thinking, that ability to think, was a fairly late accomplishment. And which were at the beginning, we just perceive. Now, I'm like, my day job is as a developmental psychologist, and I've done research on babies. And as I talk about in the book, none of this is true. There's now abundant evidence that young babies do understand objects persist when they go to sight. They can take the perspective of other people. They actually are born with a rich and powerful understanding of the social and physical world. This is work by scholars like Elizabeth Spelke and Susan Carey and Renee Bayarjon, just amazing revolution in the minds of babies. So Piaget was wrong, but he was wrong in the right way. He was wrong in that he had these interesting studies. He was clear enough to be tested wrong. And I think he played a tremendously important role in developmental psychology.
But knowing what we know now, do you think that particularly when we talk about child development, it still makes sense to talk about the dichotomy between nature and nurture? I mean, does that debate still make sense or not?
If you ask a lot of people, they would say no. I think the answer is yes. I think it actually makes perfect sense often to describe certain things about us being shaped by evolution and caused by evolutionary forces, like the color of your eyes. You didn't learn to have, blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes. It's just, you were just kind of born that way. It developed. And then there's other things like I don't know, my Zoom address. You weren't born knowing my Zoom address. You learned it. That's nurture. That's not. It wasn't even a little bit innate until I sent it to you. You didn't know it. Now, most things are not as clear as that. Most things sort of are fuzzy and complicated. You look at a question about obesity, and you say, "Oh, it's partially nature, partially nurture." Language. So people, including me, think that when somebody were born to learn language, so there's a considerable innate component. But at the same time, obviously, some people speak English and others speak Portuguese and others speak Korean and others speak, Navajo. And that's learned, that's environment. So we see the combination of nature and nurture all the time. But that doesn't mean they don't exist as separate things.
Right. And since you mentioned language there, let me ask you, how do you look at the relationship between language and thought? Because in linguistics, particularly, we have something like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which basically, in very simplistic terms, says something like the language we learn completely shapes the way we see the world. I mean, that's an extreme view, but still, what do you think about that relationship there?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's a question everyone's interested in. We know there's a deep relationship between language and thought. So for one thing, language could convey thoughts. This is what we're doing now.
Yeah.
Language can change thoughts. You could tell me something I didn't know before. Now I'm thinking about the world differently.
Mm-hmm.
Often language reflects thoughts. The structure of language reflects how we think. So I talk about some interesting cases in my book. I talk about, for instance, the language of space and the language of time seem very interconnected. So I could say my car is in the garage, and using the word in for spatial location. And I could also say, I'm going to get this paper written in an hour, using it for time. Turns out all languages do that. And it turns out that this most likely is because this is how we think. Our space thinking and our time thinking are intertwined, and it shows up in language. But what about the claim, the radical claim, that the language you learn shapes how you think? So I'm a monolingual English speaker. I learned a bit of French when I was a kid, but none of it stuck. So that's for me. How many languages do you know?
4.
4. Which one did you learn as a child?
Portuguese, and English from a very early age also.
So let's say Portuguese was your dominant language. So Portuguese and English differ in certain ways. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis say that you and me will think about the world in subtly different ways because our language shaped our thought. Now, Portuguese and English are, in a big scheme of things, fairly similar languages. But what if one of us learned Mandarin Chinese or Hopi, which is an indigenous language? So Whorf would say, oh, Hopi talks about time in all sorts of ways, so Hopi speakers think about time in all sorts of ways. It's a very radical, very interesting hypothesis, and it seems to be wrong. There's been study after study after study, and some studies find subtle differences in how speakers think that might be due to their language, but the idea that language shapes a worldview has very little support for it. It seems more that language is a mechanism for expressing, conveying, communicating thoughts than it is a force for the shaping and development of thought.
So another very big question that people debate a lot in psychology, and many people change their minds across time about, is, are humans mostly rational or irrational? Because we have there's a ton of literature on biases and heuristics and all of that, and many people for a long time have been claiming that we exhibit all sorts of irrationality, but more recently we have people like Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier claiming that it's not really that way, that even in many cases where we seem to be rational, we are, for example, ecologically rational. So what do you think about it?
The case I make, so I begin my chapter on rationality by laying out the view that we're irrational and talking a lot about the work of Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, who, Amos Tversky died, so he didn't get it, but Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for his research. And it is extraordinarily important research on all sorts of biases that people have that guide our behavior, and sometimes in seemingly irrational ways. One simple example is something called the availability bias, where when we have to figure out how frequent something is, we kind of judge that by figuring out how quickly it comes to mind, how salient examples are. And because of that, people think like school shootings, mass shootings, are far more frequent than they are, because those things end up in the news. You hear a lot about them. While people dying of heart attacks and strokes, we underestimate that because you don't hear about it. So we definitely do things which in some way in a modern world are irrational, but I'm incredibly impressed by the human capacity for rationality. I think we are just have this amazing power for rational inference. And it's this which gives us technology and society and culture and law and politics and morality. Without the capacity for rationality, you and I would never have machines that would let us be talking to each other. We would never have the interest and inclination to, as people who've never met in person, to share ideas and so on. So in the end, I acknowledge our limits, but I'm a very big fan of rationality.
Mm-hmm. And what about the things that motivate us? So what do you think is the role that stuff like emotions and feelings play in our psychology?
There's sort of a cultural idea that emotions are sort of dispensable things that we should kind of get, that, they get in the way. I don't know if you watch Star Trek, but they have Star Trek as a
A
character,
little
Mr.
bit.
Spock. So Mr. Spock or Data, who lack emotions, but are very effective. And so many programs of life, like people's attempts at Buddhism or Stoicism, come with a certain disrespect towards the emotions, particularly the negative emotions. You should get rid of them. And I think this is the wrong way to view things. These emotions exist because they play an enormous role in motivating our behavior. Gratitude motivates us to spend more time and reciprocate kindness from others. Guilt motivates us not to do a bad thing over again. Romantic love, sexual desire motivates us to approach people in ways that often lead to our reproductive success. Even the negative emotions like fear and anxiety play a critical role. It might seem like it'd be fun to live without fear, but it wouldn't be fun. You'd be dead. You wouldn't live long enough to be talking to me now. You would have wandered off into traffic or something and got yourself in some sort of trouble. Then it's not fun to have the negative emotions, but they're very good warning signals saying, don't do this. You shouldn't have done that. Get out of that situation. Don't do that again. And while the positive emotions are, good job, keep at it. Do some more of that. And these kind of push and pull us, and they're absolutely essential. To some extent, the way I'm talking about it, are shaped by evolution. They're also shaped to some extent by culture. Your culture might tell you when to be gratitude, what's worth being afraid of, how confident you should be, and all of that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, earlier I've asked you about rationality, and of course, there's not really a dichotomy between emotions and reason, right? I mean, we need emotions for us to be able to reason correctly, right?
One way to think about it is that emotions set the priorities.
Mm-hmm.
If you're afraid, you might say, I got to get away from that thing or the situation. If you're attracted to somebody, you say, I want to get close to that person. Mm-hmm. And rationality, and that an emotion set the goals, rationality tells you how to get them. It's raining outside. I don't want to get wet. So I say, I'll use my rationality. I'll bring an umbrella.
Right.
Maybe it's raining outside. I want to dance naked in the rain. Okay, I won't bring an umbrella. So the emotions could set the priorities, the goals, and in rationality, what rationality is how to get them, how to satisfy them.
Right. So in the book, you also talk about relational psychology. And of course, nowadays with political polarization and all of that, people have been talking a lot about how we are so tribal and how we differentiate between the in-groups and the out-groups and all of that, and things like racism and ethnocentrism. But before we get into a more specific question, what do you think are some of the most interesting aspects of our relational psychology, how we establish relationships with people that are part of our own groups and other groups?
Yeah, it's hard to know where to begin. There's so many interesting things. One thing is we have a very powerful similarity bias. So you see the phrase opposites attract. And that's really true for romantic comedies. It's great. It's great, makes for great scenes and great adventure. In reality, we're really drawn to people who are a lot like us. You look at real world couples, and people tend to be drawn to people pretty much like them, for all sorts of reasons. So that's one fact about relationships. Another fact, which is actually a very impressive finding from psychology, comes under the name of thin slices, which is apparently we're very good after a very brief exposure of making judgments about people. So the classic studies were done with teachers. So you get a bunch of teachers. You know how good they are as teachers based on student evaluations, whether students like them or don't like them. And then you show people, I forget the details, but it's something like a 6-second clip of the person. And then ask people, how good a teacher is this? And boom, people are strikingly accurate. Other studies find that just by glancing at somebody's face, you can make a pretty good guess as to whether they're straight or gay. You can make a pretty good guess as to whether they're liberal or conservative. And and how we do this is kind of a puzzle, but we're very good at that. But then I'll double back to your claim. One of the aspects of our relational psychology really is tribal. We are very us versus them creatures, and we seem to be this way from the get-go. There are these studies which give these kids red t-shirts and blue t-shirts, just arbitrary. And then you find that the red t-shirt kids like the red t-shirt kids more, and the blue t-shirt kids like the blue t-shirt kids more. And that's sort of an analogy of what we see with ethnicities and countries.
Mm-hmm. But are we all predisposed to be, for example, racist and ethnocentric, or not really?
I think we have the seeds within us. It to some extent, splitting the world up in this way, in this us-them way, does give us some bit of a predisposition. We're predisposed to have stereotypes of the world and different people. So for any ethnic group or racial group or age group, occupation, you'll have a stereotype of them, and there's nothing so evil about that, just sort of statistics. Mm-hmm. You may notice basketball players tend to be tall. It's a simple one. And it'd be kind of stupid not to notice that. I think, though, then you get to the role of society. So some societies really let these animosities and prejudices get exaggerated, lets them flourish, encourages them. Yeah. Others staunch them. So studies in the United States find that pretty young kids could tell Black people and white people apart. But it depends on what kind of school they go to, whether they take this difference seriously, whether they say, "Oh, I'm white, I don't like the Black people. I'm Black, I don't like the white people," or whether they just said, "It doesn't matter. It's just color different. Who cares?" And so society sometimes tells you what to attend to, what to notice.
Mm-hmm. So what we've been talking about, I think most of it is about human universals. I mean, things that are common across all people, but there's also individual differences. What are some of the main individual differences in humans?
People differ in a lot of ways. They differ in their sexual orientation. Some people attracted to men, others attracted to women. Some are attracted to both, some are attracted to neither. We differ in our gender identity. Some people see themselves as male, some female, some non-binary, some of the other categories. Often this lines up with your physical sex. Typically men see themselves as men who are natal men with penises and testicles see themselves as men and are typically heterosexual attracted to women. But as everybody knows, it doesn't always work that way. It gets complicated. People differ in how successful they are at life, measuring it other way in all sorts of ways in terms of do they have happy, fulfilling relationships? Are they in trouble with the law? Are they sad?
Right.
People differ in their personalities. So psychologists have a list of 5 personality types we're interested in. There's this great acronym, OCEAN. So O is for openness to new experience. Some are very open, some not. Conscientiousness, C. Extroversion, E, as opposed to introversion. Agreeableness, A. And neuroticism, N. Finally, we differ in there's many more cases, but we differ in our cognitive capacities. Some people are quick. Some people are good at making intuitive jumps. Some people are good at sort of book learning. Yeah. Others less so. So you have this sort of panoply of human differences.
And when it comes to personality specifically, do we know where personality differences come from? Are they, for example, evolutionary? Are they more genetic, more the result of the environment? What do we know about it?
Kind of all of the above. So some personality differences apply to different groups. Men have somewhat different personalities than women on average across the world. Men tend to be more aggressive, more risk-taking. Women are often more nurturant and empathic. Not everybody, it's like height differences. Men tend to be average, taller than women. That doesn't mean there aren't women who are taller than men or men who are shorter than women. It's just on average. Yeah. our personalities tend to change a bit when we get older. We tend to mellow out. And then at the individual level, the reason why you have the personalities that you have and I have the personality I have, it seems to be a combination of our genes. So I can get a good guess about your personality if I know the personality of your biological mother and biological father.
Mm-hmm.
But not entirely. Your environment plays a role too. Maybe how you were parented, but to a large extent, just your everyday experiences in life. Mm-hmm. So it's a sort of complicated blend where these different factors interact.
And I would imagine, as we know from disciplines like behavior genetics, that the same would apply to some of the other traits you mentioned, like cognitive ability, correct?
Yep, that's right. There's the first law of behavioral genetics is that for every psychological trait in which people differ, there's going to be an effect of genes. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not going to be 80% or 100%. But it could be, but even for things like political orientation or how religious you are, you see the genes having a force.
Mm-hmm. So getting into another topic, what is mental illness? I mean, is there some sort of, I know that there's probably not a consensus on this topic, but from the perspective of a psychologist, what is mental illness?
There's more of a consensus than you might think. I think that there's a certain radical view that says, "Oh, no such thing as mental illness at all." But I think that that's not worth taking seriously. There are people who are schizophrenic, and they have vivid hallucinations, and they need to be cared for, or else they can't survive on their own. There are people in deep depressions who cannot leave their bed. There are people so anxious they can't leave their house. There are people who have horrible obsessions and compulsions that ruin their life, that make them miserable. I'm totally comfortable calling these diseases and illnesses. Like I call cancer a disease or COVID a disease. These are terrible things that show that the mental system has gone wrong in ways that cause great human suffering. I actually think people say, those people are all fine, are often either ignorant, they don't have no experience what it's like to be or meet with someone who's schizophrenic in a severe way, or they're just naive and not thinking it through. However, there are interesting ways in which a disease like depression or schizophrenia or anxiety disorder might be interesting and different from a disease like cancer. So cancer is different types of cancer, different extremities of cancer. But it's not, well, you got cancer, you don't got cancer. But a lot of what we call as mental diseases could be seen as extreme points on normal variance. Mm-hmm. So, and there's some debate among psychiatrists and psychologists about this, but my take on it, what I think is sort of what most people might say is, sometimes I'm sad, sometimes you're sad. So if you're really sad, and maybe something happened to make you really sad, there's a certain point where we say, okay, that's too much. It's too much. It's messing you up too much. You say it's too much. You come to a psychologist and say, this is just ruining my life. So it's more like blood pressure, high blood pressure. There's no magic point where it's high blood pressure. It's just we say, okay, around there, you better take some pills for it. You better get treated for it. And so too, I think, for things like depression, anxiety, a little bit of sadness, a little bit of anxiety. It's not only part and parcel of life, it's part and parcel of a good life. There are valuable things to have. But if it's too much, it might need treatment. And then the question of what a mental illness is, what constitutes a case where we say, okay, you're eligible for government health care. Okay, you could take time off work. Okay, we got to treat you, becomes to some extent a social question. How much introversion is okay? Sometimes I think, though I'm very much into the idea that we should treat these things, sometimes I think society should be more amenable, should do more to help people who are on the extremes rather than treat the people. One example which I find interesting, it's not a mental illness, it's a personality type, is the world very much favors extroverts. Here we are, extroverts, just talking to each other, having fun, getting out there and like that. Maybe we're introverts in other ways, but we're extrovert enough to get there.
Yeah.
But introverts have an enormous amount to offer in ways different from extroverts. People with varying degrees of autistic symptoms or autistic traits, people with autism. There are severe cases where people can't talk, they need to be fed, they need to be treated, and that we want to cure. But to be someone autistic carries with it strengths and weaknesses. And instead of rushing to say, let's cure this, let's fix this, maybe we should try to construct our world better so that we can make the world better for people in these situations and let them take advantage of their strengths.
Mm-hmm. But I was also wondering, why is it the case that mental illnesses exist at all? I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, is it that even the cases where we can have a real clinical diagnosis of, let's say, schizophrenia, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, something like that, that in certain contexts they might still be functional?
It is possible. One way to answer your question is to say, why do illnesses exist at all? I mean, we have this natural selection, why, causing us to be shaped for reproduction success. Why do little kids get leukemia? Why do adults get cancer? Why do they get high blood pressure, strokes, and everything like that? And there's different answers. So the reason why I'm saying this is not everything's an adaptation. Mm-hmm. Our bodies are extremely complicated systems, and there's all sorts of trade-offs, and sometimes just stuff goes wrong. And true for brains. So some things that go wrong might just be because systems are not perfect and they crash in different ways. But I have some sympathy for what you're saying, which is you can look at it from an adaptive point of view. And that could take you in two directions. One direction is there might be some aspects of us that are adaptive in the environment in which we evolved, but they aren't so adaptive in this modern world full of billions of people. So one example would be many children, maybe boys, they can't sit still for school. They're bopping around, they're running around, and then maybe they get diagnosed as attention deficit disorder. And I want to sort of be agnostic about what to think about that, but taking it more theoretically, being a kid and wanting to run around, not wanting to sit still at a desk for 8 hours, is a really normal thing for our brains to evolve. And we're just in a very funny world where we demand something special from people. It could be argued, people make the case that social media accelerates depression in a deep way. And this, again, could be our minds were not evolved for the sort of stimulus that social media gives us. And then there's the idea that some traits that we have are either sort of co-occur with traits that are good. Some people argue that schizophrenic traits often co-occur with creativity. I'm somewhat skeptical, but that could be true. That autistic traits co-occur with abilities to focus and a sort of systematizing capacity, leading to some really interesting and ingenious work. Mm-hmm. So you're right to caution me to be not so quick to say just because something goes wrong, it's necessarily a glitch in the system, as opposed to something that might have some benefit and we just don't see it.
Mm-hmm. Also, because I'm making that point or bringing that to the table also because perhaps certain points that, for example, sociologists make about mental illness, at least to some extent, could be fair. Like, for example, we could still say that the mental illness is there, but perhaps in certain cases, in certain social contexts, there might be a place for people to express their specific traits. Like, for example, people like Robert Sapolsky talk about or speculate about schizophrenia, how schizophrenia might have played a role in the development of religious texts or religious theories, because some people hear voices and they might think that it's God talking to them, or in terms of religious rituals, people who suffer from compulsive disorder, some of them really seem compulsive, so you do these in that order, a particular number of steps, you pray a particular number of times. So I mean, I'm as I said, I'm not saying that the mental illness is not there, but perhaps there are certain contexts where people might not feel as distressed because they have sort of a place in society where they can at least be somewhat functional, let's say.
I agree with that. I agree with that. I think autism again is a really good case of thinking it that way. I guess I would just also say, and I'm not sure we disagree on this, but I'd also say that there are extreme cases. There are people who are so depressed they desperately want to kill themselves. They're so depressed that they can't leave their bed. They don't want to go to the toilet. They don't want to. They just want to withdraw. And they're in savage, unbearable pain. And I don't see any silver lining to that. I just think, man, let's figure out a way to make you better, and the world will be so much of a better place.
And about figuring out a way to making it better, what do we know about how mental illness can be treated? Of course, we have many different approaches in clinical psychology. We have psychoanalysis, we have cognitive behavior therapy, we have existential / humanist approaches, and so on. So what do we know about what's the best way of approaching mental illness?
So we sort of know two general things that contradict each other a little bit. One is that therapy works. And each of these mental illnesses have their own sort of best practice therapy. If you have phobias, cognitive behavioral therapy sort of works. If you're depressed, often cognitive behavioral therapy, but also talking to people, medication often works. Sometimes people say mindfulness meditation works, which is controversial, but maybe a direction. But some people believe that the true efficacy of therapy has to do with features that just about all therapies have, which is the idea that somebody cares for you, the idea that somebody is on your side, the notion of hope, the notion of optimism. But in general, if someone suffers from a mental illness, they should see a therapist. Or for the most part, it's a good idea. So that's the one half of it. The second half of it is we're nowhere near as good as we should be. And people have pointed out that despite the progress in psychology and other fields, clinical psychology treatments kind of hit a sort of standstill for the last 20, 30 years. There's been no new miracle drugs that have come out, no dramatic new treatments. People are interested in things. There's people interested in psychedelics, maybe that'll play an important role. People are interested in other things, but progress is slow. We're at an early stages. So therapy works, but I'd love to see a world 20 years from now, 30 years from now, where therapy works a lot better. Like, for instance, where somebody could come in with depression. And right now, many people do respond well to drugs, but you have to try different drugs. Nobody knows what drug works until you finally get one. And then sometimes that stops working, you have to get another one. Imagine a world where somebody comes into depression, you give them a drug that will alleviate their suffering, and then boom, it would just work. But just like antibiotics, reduce inflammation and infection.
Mm-hmm. So I have one last topic I would like to ask you about today. So what is a good life for humans? I mean, this question has been addressed traditionally by philosophers, but can psychologists also help us answer that question?
So I think as psychologists, there's a sense in which we can't. The question of what makes a good life isn't a psychological question. If you wanted to say that a good life involves being very happy, and I wanted to say a good life involves being a good person and helping others, even if it doesn't make you happy. It's not like I'm going to say, I'm a psychologist, man, you got to listen to me. That's just not, these are philosophical views that are not themselves grounded in research or data or psychological theory. My own view, and I wrote a book on this called The Sweet Spot, is that a good life, we should drive for many things. It's sort of a pluralism where we should try to be happy, we should try to get pleasure, we should try to have meaning, we should try to be moral, and other things besides. What psychology does have to offer is, once you choose something that you want to maximize part of your good life, we can then look to see how do people attain it. So if you ask people what they want, a lot of people say, I want to be happy. And we've learned some things about being happy. We've learned that happiness is related to money. Maybe it's the least surprising thing of all, but money makes people happy to a certain extent. We've learned that maybe the biggest effect of happiness is social connections. It's easier to be happy if you have people who love you, if you have friends who care for you. We know happiness varies with age, which is kind of a cool finding. And maybe not in a way you'd expect, where there's generalizations across many countries where people kind of maybe on average, they're kind of happy. And then it dips until the mid-50s. And they're at their lowest ebb. And then they start rising up again. So some of the happiest people in the world are very old people.
Yeah.
We know that there's surprisingly no big sex differences in happiness, for whatever reason. Women are more prone to depression than men, but men have more substance disorders, more violent, die younger. And maybe it's all washes out, but there's no big sex differences. So we know a few things about what makes a happy life.
So, I mean, with that in mind, it's for each individual person to basically set the parameters or set their goals, also because there are individual differences in personality and so on, and perhaps culture might also play a role here in how much people value different things. And I mean, I might be interested in this and not that. I might have this goal in life and not that one. I might not even care that much about happiness and care more about meaning. That's or right. Something like that. But once we have the parameters set, we can ask psychologists how to get there. Is that it?
I think that's very nicely put. And that's very nicely put.
Okay, great. So the book is again Psych, the story of the human mind. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of this interview. And Dr. Bloom, you've already said this in previous interviews, but would you like to mention again where people can find you and your work on the internet?
I'm on Twitter at Paul Bloom at Yale, and I have a website, paulbloom.net.
Okay.
How to get in touch with me.
Great. So I'm adding also that to the links in the description, and also our two previous interviews, which were very interesting. So Dr. Bloom, thank you again for coming on the show, and thank you for writing this book, which I recommend to everyone out there listening and watching this interview, because it's a very good read.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun talking to you. I always learn a lot.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description box of this interview. And if you like this interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litzka, Blanchett Perga, Larson, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Herbert Gintis, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Jorge Pinha, Michael Stormer, Samuel Andrea, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonio Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rosmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzka, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, João Barbosa, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Harrington, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, and Igor N., And special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.